We have with us this morning, ladies and gentlemen, a particularly interesting and colorful guest. He is Mr. Kevin Moran O'Riordan, one of the two adventuresome men who set a world record sailing a small yacht from England to New York in 47 days across the North Atlantic at the worst time of the year. I think it is even more unusual and fascinating to discover that Mr. O'Riordan is also a retired officer in the Indian Police and a grandfather. Well, Mr. O'Riordan, we would like very much to know how you happened to take on such a trip.
Well, I'm surprised myself at it, but I was up in Scotland at the wedding of my younger boy, who is in the Royal Navy, and just beforehand he produced a telegram sent by Mr. Humphrey Barton, the owner of this ship, asking me if I would sail across the Atlantic with him.
I bet you were surprised to get a message like that, weren't you?
I indeed was. I took it to my wife thinking that she would certainly say nonsense, and to my surprise she said, "Go, you've always wanted to do that."
Well,
so we took the night train to Leamington, and I sailed the following day.
Well, how did your wife know that you'd always wanted to make a trip like that, Mr. O'Riordan?
Well, I've read a great many of these books of ocean voyages, and it all seemed so lovely and so simple that I felt there was no reason why I shouldn't do it. It would be a very good way to spend the days of my retirement. But what with various war adventures and accidents, I never had enough money to do it, and then I got too old, and that was the end of it.
Well, I suppose you've read the books of Captain Harry Pigeon and Captain Josiah Slocum and all those, haven't you?
Read them not only once, but many times.
Yes, they're thrilling. There's another book, too, I wonder if you've read, that interested me very much. The Voyage of the Caterpillar. Did you ever read that?
Yes, I read that not so long ago. It was a very interesting book, and I thought some people have all the luck and all the adventure. It didn't seem ever like that I should be mixed up in a party like that.
Well, Mr. O'Riordan, do you think you would have gone if you'd had more time to think it over?
I don't think at all I should have. I should have been too scared. But when my wife told me to go, it was almost a command, and I hadn't the face to turn back, so I went.
Yes? Well, how did your relatives and friends react to your going?
Oh, my own relations were shocked, but not surprised. They knew I was liable to do things of this sort. But my wife did all the arranging for me with her usual efficiency, and so there was nothing left for me to do but just to step on board.
And so you did?
I did.
Well, Mr. O'Riordan, what was the real purpose of the trip?
Well, this wasn't really a freak adventure. It was a very definite business proposition. The English yacht builders are very anxious to sell their boats over in America in order to earn dollars, and by earning dollars they hope to be able to increase their home production and make more yachts available in England. Well, this boat was owned by Mr. Humphrey Barton of the firm of Lawrence Giles of Leamington, and they have been busy for a number of years in designing ocean racing boats. And this is a small edition, and they believe this to be the finest boat that ever had been designed. And they were particularly anxious to sell it in America, as they thought that the design and the workmanship would appeal to the fine appreciation of the American yachtsman. And they hope to be able to sell it at a favorable price owing to devaluation.
Well, certainly you put that yacht to a great test, didn't you? And it came through with flying colors, didn't it, Mr. O'Riordan?
Yes, the yacht never failed. In fact, the success of the venture was primarily due to the seaworthiness of the ship, and secondly, to the organization and preparation of the owner, Mr. Humphrey Barton.
And Mr. Barton made the trip with you, didn't he?
Yes, he was. There were just the two of us.
Yes. Well, Mr. O'Riordan, had you had very much experience with boats and navigation prior to that time?
No, I had spent all my life out in India, 1,000 miles away from the sea, and it was only in my declining years that I took to this dangerous sport. I had no previous practical experience of navigation, and when Mr. Barton offered to do the cooking, if I would do the navigation, I chose the navigation because I thought at least I shan't be found out until near the end of the voyage, and there will be time before then for me to learn something about it.
And that's the way you did it.
That's how I did it.
Without experiences, you became captain of a ship. Well, did you ever go off your course, Mr. O'Riordan?
Yes, the original course that we laid out was what is known as a Great Circle course, which is the shortest line between 2 points on the ocean. But the winds headed us off consistently until we found ourselves several hundred miles south of our projected course.
Well, excuse me. You were going on, were you?
But we were able to remedy that afterwards by more favorable winds, which enabled us to keep along the 35th parallel of latitude until we got close to the Gulf Stream. And there we set a course northwesterly so as to allow for the set of the stream. And actually, to my intense surprise, we made our objective, Sandy Hook, in one.
Well, that was very, very interesting. To touch on the more domestic side of the voyage, as you might know, I would, Mr. O'Riordan. What foods did you take with you?
Well, we were very well supplied, thanks to the extraordinary preparations made by Mr. Humphrey Barton and his wife. We started out with a vast quantity of bread, which lasted us about 3 weeks. It didn't look very much like bread towards the end of that time.
I'm sure it didn't.
But you can't be too fussy on an occasion of that sort. And then we had a box of oranges, which we continued to eat even when they ceased to look altogether like fresh oranges. And at Falmouth, I was extremely lucky in prevailing upon a butcher to give me a large round of beef, which was very kindly cooked for us by the steward of the Royal Cornish Yacht Club, and that lasted us another week. Then we had cured bacon beef and a lot of eggs.
Did you have dried foods of any kind, such as beans and peas and...
Yes, we had a very nice
kind?
cheese presented by one of the well-wishers of the expedition, and that, by keeping it covered with buttered paper, lasted us almost to the end.
Oh, wonderful. Mr. O'Riordan, had you refrigeration of any kind aboard?
No, we had nothing like that at all. There was no room.
I suppose not.
The boat was carrying a vast quantity of stores and gear and water. And there was no room whatever for anything at all in the way of fancy equipment.
Yes. Well, how about clothes? What clothes did you take with you?
Well, we didn't bring many clothes because there was very little room to stow any gear. And one brought the oldest things one had, as one never expected them to go back again. But mostly we wore trousers and jerseys. And
But you took along plenty of warm things, I hope.
Well, I took a few warm things, as I understood that we might be going far north in the Atlantic, but actually, the wind heading us off, we went down to 35 degrees south, and there, when it was fine, it was beautifully warm weather.
I'm sure
And
it
we
was.
didn't really want any warm clothes at all.
Did you run into any very rough weather?
Yes, we had quite a patch of bad weather going down the channel, and then again for on and off during the first month, the winds were either rough or very rough, and we weren't making as good progress as we had hoped. Although we were doing a good enough mileage, we weren't doing it in the right direction.
Yes.
And it looked at one time as if we were going to be a bit behindhand.
Getting back to your clothes, Mr. O'Riordan, were you able to launder your clothes? Did you bother about such things?
We washed when it rained.
Oh, I see. You caught the
We
rainwater.
couldn't spare water, fresh water for washing.
Of course
So
not.
occasionally when it rained, we would lay out our clothes in the cockpit and let them get soaked through and rinse them out and then hang them up to dry.
Well, I should think that on a long trip like that, two people alone together in the middle of a great stretch of water might become rather bored with each other's company. Did you find any way of amusing yourselves? Or were you too busy?
We were always too busy. There was no time for any amusement, except such as was provided by the working of the ship. The main items were to steer, to navigate, to eat, and to sleep.
Yes.
And as the longest spell of sleep that we could possibly have at any one time was 4 hours, it meant that one had to try and get sleep on every possible occasion.
Mm. You took regular turns like that?
Yes, we worked it in regular watches the whole way through.
And did you keep feeling reasonably well?
I had no trouble of any kind whatever, except that I broke 2 teeth on the ship's biscuits and got terrible toothache.
Oh, what a shame.
But
long way from the dentist, weren't you?
I kept very quiet about my toothache because I knew that Mr. Barton had got a complete set of dentist equipment on board, and I was scared that he might want to experiment on me.
Yes, I can see exactly what you mean.
Some days afterwards, when I told him I'd had all this toothache, he looked rather reproachfully at me for not having given him the opportunity.
That was rather mean, Mr. O'Riordan. Did you have any encounters with, I suppose it's a silly question, animals of the sea?
Well, on 2 occasions, we were accompanied for half a day by masses of porpoises frolicking around us.
Oh, well, they're pretty,
They seemed to be very inquisitive and very playful. Later on the American side, I was surprised one morning to see a whole formation of large whale-like beasts coming charging down towards us. But fortunately, they turned away before they could close in on the ship.
Well, that was fortunate indeed.
The most interesting thing about the voyage was the small birds that followed us the whole way across the Atlantic. They were Mother Carey's chickens, and they continued to fly round and round the ship, night and day, the whole way across.
Did they rest on the ship upon occasion?
They didn't rest on the ship. They rested on the sea occasionally.
Uh-huh.
And as far as I could make out, it was the same birds that followed us the whole way through. And they left us when we approached New York. They apparently didn't like the dirty water that was coming out of the great seaport, and we lost them then.
And you think maybe they turned around and went home again?
Well, unless they looked out for another foolish adventurer to follow.
Yes. Well, on the whole, Mr. O'Riordan, were there greater or fewer hardships than you'd expected?
It was much, now that I'm back on the land and feeling brave, I can say it was much easier than I had ever been told to expect. I had the idea that I was going to be killed on this trip, but it really was an extremely comfortable trip, provided that you can put up with that kind of austere living,
yes,
which of course is nothing new to us in England.
Well, did you really feel that the trip had been worthwhile upon reaching America?
Oh, yes. I used to think now and then, what manner of idiot was I to have come out on a voyage like this? But since I've been in America, I realize that I'm extremely fortunate to have made this voyage. I've had the most extraordinary, enthusiastic welcome and kindly reception wherever I've been. In fact, I'm embarrassed by the extraordinary and overpowering kindness of the American people. They are all so terribly interested in this story that I have the greatest difficulty in persuading them that it is nothing unusual, that any one of them could do it.
Not any one of us would do it, though, Mr. O'Riordan. And we're certainly happy that we have been able to welcome you to this program. By the way, how long are you going to stay in the United States, do you think?
Well, I'm sorry to say that I've got to sail back on Saturday. But I have been thinking all along, how can I possibly come back to this great land and enjoy its plenitude? And with any luck, I shall come back again in some capacity hereafter.
And we hope you'll bring your wife with you, Mr. O'Riordan.
That is the one thing that is missing from this great adventure, because my wife would have enjoyed it more than I can say.
Yes.
And I think America would have enjoyed her company just as much.
Would you like to sail back the way you came?
Oh, yes, I would. I have been thinking all along, how can I possibly come back to this great land and enjoy its plenitude? And I think America would have enjoyed her company just as much.
Would you like to sail back the way you came? Mr. O'Riordan?
Well, actually, I thought it would be a good thing if, having come on the smallest boat, I went back on the biggest. So
Yes.
I'm going back on the Queen Mary. But I would be quite prepared to do an ocean trip again if the circumstances permitted it. It isn't difficult, and if you are able to enjoy looking at the water forever and ever, then there's no reason whatever why one shouldn't do these ocean cruises.
Well, we do hope that you will come back again, Mr. O'Riordan, and that you will bring Mrs. O'Riordan with you, that you will have a safe and happy voyage home. And thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Oh, thank you. I'm very glad indeed to have had this opportunity of thanking the great American people for what has been the high spot of my life.
Thank you again. Our guest, ladies and gentlemen, has been Mr. Kevin Moran O'Riordan, who, with Mr. Humphrey Barton, has set a world record sailing a small yacht from England to New York in 47 days.